forecast called for another beautiful Sunday in paradise. It promised to be a day of hope and encouragement. The paper spoke of a new beginning. Those behind the scenes saw a different picture. It wasn't one of euphoria or optimism. It was reality. If the proper steps of preparation weren't taken, they could be thrust into a conflict they were ill prepared to tackle. On the surface, the politicians were painting a rosy picture and easing the fears of the populace that they would not be thrust into a conflict which was none of their affair. That is what people wanted to hear and believe. Why shouldn't they? Why would the governments around the world lie to us? There was no rational reason. Sure, there were other countries already dealing with the conflict, but again, it wasn't our problem. As the sun broke over a calm, peaceful horizon, promising tranquility permeated the atmosphere. Nothing could spoil such a wonderful, majestic landscape. At 7:58, everything changed. The enemy showed up with a vengeance unparalleled in history. It was a surprise attack no one saw coming. The attack was so successful our defenses were annihilated. Our bastion of strength was destroyed in less than 2 hours. Many said there was no warning. Others said we should have been more prepared. Many said a lot of things, but that would be sorted out years later. This was not the time to start looking for blame. It was a time for the leaders to come together, unite as one, and fight the common enemy. The declaration of war was quick. The country rallied together for a common cause against a known enemy. Industries that had been dormant and complacent rallied to the call. It didn't matter what they believed or didn't believe. They knew it was time to set aside petty grievances to preserve their way of life in their country. No one asked why it happened. No one questioned how they would respond. Communities across the country came together to the common cause. This was war, and those who brought it to our soil were going to pay, and pay big. Industry ramped up. Millions answered the call to fight the enemy. Those who weren't able to serve on the front lines or the factories sacrificed for those who could, but they weren't out of the fight. They organized events, grew gardens, handled scrap efforts, and though they weren't happy with the government rationing, it was required to help the effort. Everyone pitched in, for the price of not helping was not an option. Sure, many grumbled, but they knew what was at stake. The once sleepy nation was thrust into the spotlight and began to shine. It didn't happen overnight, and the initial years didn't provide a glossy picture. But giving up and succumbing was not an option. Through grit, determination, sacrifice, and old-fashioned know-how, they began churning out the implements of war at a dizzying pace. The enemy severely underestimated the resolve of their opponent. In a few years, the men, material, and implements of war flooded warehouses and docks. What was once unheard of was becoming a reality. The full weight of this country was moving forward at a rapid pace, overwhelming the enemy in a way they could not foresee. It didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. Did the people whimper and whine, trying to assign blame for being thrust into a situation they weren't familiar with? No. They answered the call and marched forward. Why? Because they were Americans and they would protect their way of life at all costs. This was the mindset of a nation thrust into war they didn't want, but when the consequences of not getting into the fight were outlined, reality set in. We must come together as a nation and fight. 19 years ago, the resolve of the country again became united after 9/11. Democrats and Republicans came together as one, held hands, and sang the national anthem together. They joined together, and once again we fought. But there was a caveat that was missing from World War II era. What could that be? A press corps that continued to be biased and not in a good way. When we invaded Tarawa Island in 1943, our casualties were 33% compared to the Japanese forces we faced. When the results were passed on to FDR, he cringed. Such information could not be released to the American public for fear that they would not have the stomach knowing how much farther they would have to go to win this war and the cost in lives. Imagine how today's press would react with that information. They wouldn't detail the victory we achieved. They would want to know who is responsible for this tragedy that cost so many American lives, and for what? A mere 1 square mile of territory? Today's press would be livid. In 1944, another momentous event occurred, the Battle of the Bulge. Before December 16, 1944, many thought the war was going to be over by Christmas. Plans were being made to demobilize and greet the German surrender. Everything changed when Hitler released his last large armored reserves on the unsuspecting troops. They tore through our lines, decimating division after division. The onslaught seemed unstoppable. Once again, our troops rallied. The amount of heroic efforts were innumerable. Internally, there were reservations with the lax attitude on the front lines. The area the Germans chose was thinly held, with the Green Division not tried in combat. How would today's press handle that event? They would want heads on a spike. Imagine Eisenhower, Bradley, Montgomery, and Hodge being called to Washington for an investigation. Imagine them being relieved of their duties. For one, I cannot fathom such a move and the dire consequences it would have had on the outcome of the war. I know I got a little off point, which is normal when I talk about history. The point here is simple. We are at war with an enemy, the coronavirus. There were warnings about it, but not enough information to make informed decisions. When the president did make a decision, the press blasted him for such rash action and xenophobia. It is easy to start analyzing and criticizing the actions a president takes. FDR, shutting down the banks, trying to pack the Supreme Court, giving up too much at Yalta, Truman, firing MacArthur, Johnson, Gulf of Tonkin resolution, Nixon, lying about Watergate, Reagan, lying about the Iran-Contra affair, Bush Sr., bailing out the S&Ls, Clinton, selling medium ICBM technology to North Korea, Bush Jr., no child left behind in the horrible rebuilding of Iraq, Obama, the handling of the H1N1 virus and the Affordable Health Care Act, and yes, Trump, arguing on Twitter with everyone who doesn't agree with him. Stop it and shut up. Also in the crisis, let the experts handle the press conferences. You don't have a clue what you are talking about. Take a cue from the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, okay? It took America 2 years for the weight of her manufacturing capacity to start turning the tide with planes, ships, tanks, uniforms, supplies, guns, shells, and bullets. Along with that, the military was starting at page 1, not 2, 3, or 4. 1. That too took time. Guadalcanal, North Africa, midway where the battles where lessons were learned and tactics perfected. It didn't happen overnight. It took time. So here we are in another war, and instead of our leaders coming together, they're squabbling in the halls of Congress. I don't give a damn which side of the political spectrum you're on. This battle affects us all like it did our grandparents. We are at war and need to fight the common enemy. It isn't a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent. It's a virus that can strike down anyone. Anyone. Any legislation passed must deal with only fighting the virus. That's it. Pure and simple. Nothing else matters right now. What matters is stabilizing the country, helping those who are out of work, providing the required PPE, and supporting those on the front lines who are at risk. Doctors, nurses, first responders, truck drivers, clerks, shippers, food delivery service, and retail employees. Many of the services that we took for granted are the ones keeping us moving forward. They were showing us who the backbone of the country is, and it isn't Washington, D.C. For those who have been forced to stay home, they need the help the most, and they need it now. Not in a week, not in a month, now. Yes, that also includes the companies they work for. If those companies are the so-called evil corporations, GE, Boeing, American Airlines, Ford, GM, Walmart, and others go under, where will the people go back to work? That also includes the fast food industry, Wendy's, McDonald's, Taco Bell, Popeyes, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and others. By definition, these are all major evil corporations, or are they? My point, many people and companies have already answered the call and are helping out, but it does take time. What doesn't help is the media chomping on the bit trying to assign blame. What doesn't help is a dysfunctional Congress, both aisles. What will win the fight is a United States. And how does this happen? Since most of us are home, start calling and emailing your representatives and tell them you are sick and tired of the political games, the posturing, and the useless interviews where everyone wants to assign blame. Put the country first, not the party, and get to work. It's why you are there. Americans, this is our day of infamy.